Professor Lovemore Madhuku following the ZANU PF conference 2 weeks ago. And his punchline, that it's all noise, and that the loudest noise becomes the resolution. We're laughing about it, but in the last few days, this campaign has become much more serious than we thought. When our seminar room, the symbol of our discussion over the last 30 to 40 years, was attacked, bombed, and our security guard on duty abducted. Happily, he's back, but it showed the seriousness with which any challenge to what appears to be an empty, noisy slogan is being viewed by the system, by the state. So we really need to interrogate this slogan. It's full of meaning. It's less, in my view, about Emerson Mnangagwa wanting to stay until 2030 than it is an expression of a system that is resilient, opposed to change. It is about a state that, as we have written and have stated on this platform, that is resistant to change, incapable, lacking the capacity to change, and hence the reality of a secure state that we have characterized many times. And therefore, the 2030 agenda is perhaps the idea, beginning with Mugabe himself, wanted to die in office, that Emerson Mnangagwa would like to die in office. And therefore, it raises the question, how shall civic society, how should Zimbabweans react to this? And I think we need to go beyond just the opposition to the particular individual, Mnangagwa in this case. I think we need to interrogate more and more the nature and content of the Zimbabwean state, of which Mnangagwa is only a representative, and of which Mugabe was an earlier expression of the same. He didn't talk about dying in office. It was clearly his objective. And now we have his successor, Emerson Mnangagwa, saying exactly the same. I think also we need to go beyond what we see on the surface and consider once again the configuration of forces around Mnangagwa, including the challenge, if any, to him by his deputy, Chiwenga. Is it a vain challenge? Is he overtaken by events? We saw, for example, that the generals who were behind and around Chiwenga were systematically removed. We saw Sanyatwe, an alleged ally of Chiwenga, chucked aside into the Ministry of Sports. We've seen, notwithstanding the spirited opposition of the people like Mchangwa and Chiwenga himself to the elevation of or inclusion of Tagwire into the Central Committee, become a reality. He's there. And we have to start asking questions. We have enough lawyers around this platform. But for us from political economy to ask questions, is it really about the Constitution? Given that the whole history of the constitutionalism in Zimbabwe has been very, what can I say, maybe not really founded in our politics. People like Madhuku are the forerunners in the National Constitutional Assembly, the NCA, the origins of a constitutional movement, which sought to highlight that the state, modern state, has to be governed by something. And the Constitution is just more than just a piece of paper. It is a guideline to the conduct of citizens in the relationship between the rulers and the ruled. And it's an expression of the democratic ideal of an accountable executive, a vibrant legislature, and a fiercely independent judiciary. That these key elements of a democratic society are absent in this local situation is no surprise given our trajectory. And is it a little belated, if I may ask, and I'm asking this of our constitutional lawyers, whom I will introduce shortly. Wasn't the Constitution fundamentally breached in 2017 in the form of the coup? And the provisions therein which justify the coup, and further, as in advance justified any other coup in the Chiweshe judgment. Are we in a constitutional order? And if not, why are we so fervent about the idea of protecting the Constitution as a sacred feature of our society? So these are some of the things we want to discuss today. And without preempting any further, I'd like to introduce my panel, Professor Lovemore Madhuku, clearly the leading constitutional lawyer in this country, but also a political animal in his own right. Welcome, Professor Madhuku. And following on him is one of his proteges, Justice Mavezenge, who is based in Cape Town, also a constitutional lawyer, written a lot on the subject of the Constitution and the Zimbabwean political process. Justice, welcome. And Tendai Mbofana, an activist, fearless, and very, very present in the discourse, current discourse in our country. So, we'll begin with Professor Madhuku to introduce the subject, to explain to us whether this is just noise or is something more than noise. Welcome, sir.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mandaza, and I'm quite privileged to be able to join you on this policy dialogue framework. I will just straight go to the subject. I won't be long, and I want to start where I should start, whether this is just empty loud noise or is a real challenge for Zimbabweans. I must make it clear that it cannot be just empty loud noise, and that it is a real challenge for Zimbabweans. The choice between those is quite straightforward as far as I'm concerned. I must make it clear that, yes, when I spoke with the BBC right after hearing the 2030 resolution being repeated in Mutare, that statement I made, which has been going the rounds, was actually a reaction of irritation and frustration. So it was just to make light of a very deep feeling in me when I made that point, just making light. But I was quite surprised that we were still at that stage going that far. Because as we all know, ZANU-PF made this so-called resolution number 1 in 2024 in Bulawayo, and nothing was done. We were hoping that they will not do anything. We all know what happened, and then eventually they are back in Mutare, and we see them now with a new framework, which was indicating that they want to move. So I must make clear that that was the context. It's not, we cannot say that we are not familiar with the real challenges, and I must now start from there. From your opening remarks, Chair, Moderator, Professor Mandas, I think you raised an issue of whether the Constitution does play a part in our politics here and what part it has played. I think that it is important for us in Zimbabwe and all those who are following the struggles here to ensure that we don't deal with our issues on the basis of a purely legalistic framework, which is to say, what provision of the Constitution has been breached, what does it mean? I think in the past few days, and in fact, now a few weeks, there has been a lot that has been written, especially by legal experts or analysts, on the nitty-gritties of the Constitution and say, this can happen, this. That kind of debate, with all due respect, may not be the appropriate one in terms of the legal accuracy or what is legally possible. I say so because all legal arguments remain legal opinions. And at the end, a legal argument would have to be resolved by a court, because the proper place of a legal argument is a court of law. You'll have to go to a court in a real situation, a dispute, and the court must choose which legal position they take, or they can come up with their own. So we shouldn't concentrate on that. I think we should concentrate on what is it that we have experienced we would want. We would want a society that is democratic, a society that is able to understand where we are going and where we are coming from, and ultimately a society that is able to provide for all our ideals as a nation. And there I would use the term, which I hope can be acceptable. It has always been termed in our field, the term of constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is not about rules. It is about principles. It is about, fundamental frameworks that ought to exist. And there is one fundamental framework which ought to exist, whether you call it constitutionalism or democracy or whatever. That fundamental framework is that you must derive your authority to govern, and that the structure of the state must be founded on the will of the people. And the will of the people is not merely claiming that that will exists. It is by really living it. You cannot have a situation where those who are in office would decide that they would want to remain in office for whatever reason. And because they would want to remain in office, they must then claim that that is the wish of the people, without allowing the ordinary democratic manifestations of the will of the people. That's where the problem that we have. So in this country, we all have to point out, and I must point it out, when I was following and analyzing what was happening, I realized that, and I must put it across to the public, ZANU-PF has never been responsible for any real democratic reform from 1980. If you look at our constitutional changes, if you look at our democratic frameworks, they have been responsible more for narrowing the democratic space. While all progressive provisions, that these few things you have in our constitution which can really stand up and help everyone else, they have had to be forced on ZANU-PF. And I must say so. We have a Lancaster House constitution in 1980. If you look at their various amendments, from amendment number 1 up to the very last amendment, which I would call amendment number 18. Amendment number 19 is about the inclusive government. But up to amendment number 18, if you look at those amendments, you'll see ZANU-PF everywhere. And where you get, whenever they input into the constitution, they deal with the aspect of restricting democratic space. And they are responsible for the 1987 executive presidency, which clearly undermined everything that would have been the checks and balances in the constitution. So I'm making the contribution that when we say it's a real challenge for Zimbabweans, it is a real challenge in the sense that when ZANU-PF speaks in the manner that it has spoken around the 2030 agenda, they are at it again, which they are always at, which is to undermine and restrict the little democratic space you may have in the country. That's where it becomes a challenge. And if we do not react and fight them, they will restrict it. They have no shame in coming up with anything that doesn't make sense unless you stand up and say no to all that. So although we had a 2013 constitution, which had been fought for by many, ZANU-PF was able to try and regulate the manner in which it was to happen so that it doesn't become a full-blown democratic project. It would then have to reflect a few things. And then they grudgingly accepted things that they never believed in. And one such thing, when the 2 terms was put in the constitution, the group around President Mugabe then, and the group that is now running the country under President Mnangagwa, they put 2 terms for Mugabe. So people didn't know that they used the constitutional reform movement at that time, the 2013 constitutional discussions, for the ZANU-PF insiders who were already unclear as to how they would deal with President Mugabe, then took what we were putting in genuinely to restrict these things. They had in their mindset, they never believed in a 2-term framework. It was put in to deal with Mugabe. And that's the purpose. And that's why you see that from 2013, they had already wanted Mugabe out, but they couldn't. Then they put that in the constitution. Now, somewhat in a way, in 2017, they managed to have Mugabe not even go to the 2nd term that he thought he would go under the new constitution. Remember, you pass a constitution 33 years after Mugabe's rule, and you still say Mugabe starts afresh, which is what the 2013 constitution was all about. We started counting as if he had done nothing for 33 years. So if you look at that, my submission, and I want to make this clear, Professor Mandaza, that when you look at the character of Zimbabweans, there's a time when we also lose our guard. I mean, how on earth would we have agreed in 2013 to a situation that Mugabe would not be affected by the new constitution? He hasn't served any term. We'll start counting. And when those guys agreed to have the 2 terms, they were just targeting Mugabe. So it was like a combined effort against Mugabe. So President Mnangagwa then with his group, they had 2 strategies against Mugabe. The first one was the 2-term limit, while on the other hand, it was the second plan B, which eventually succeeded when they took over from him. So I'm saying that ZANU-PF people in the government never believed in the ideals of a new constitution. They do not support the concept of constitutionalism. They do not support. So the 2030 agenda is the greatest indication, in fact, the greatest manifestation of where they have always stood, which is that we don't care about that. And where you get it, it says that President Mnangagwa is just being used, not, I'm not sure what word I can use, you'll help the other panelists. But he is not the factor there. He is a front for a much more serious framework. Every ZANU-PF president, towards the end of their term or whatever, they get captured. That is the ZANU-PF modus operandi. So like we saw in the last 4 or 5 years of President Mugabe, we were no longer having President Mugabe as Mugabe that we knew in 1987 or in 1980. We had a system, and that is the system that played the thing. Now President Mnangagwa is no longer in charge of the framework. He is now also, he has to give in fact, that's how the system operates. He has to agree to be a front. And to be a front there means you can say 2030 and you call it an ED agenda and you can have songs around that and sing as a... No, it's not about ED. It is about entrenching a particular system that they believe Zimbabweans may not be able to... So you pick up an opportunity. I say so, Chair and my fellow panelists, because the 2030 agenda means, as far as we know, Parliament's term will be extended, all MPs will remain, councillors will remain, everyone will remain. That's what they want to do. That is what the proposal says. So it's not just about President Mnangagwa going for 2 years, eventually everyone. And then the 2 years is just being put as a 2030 agenda. But if you can put 2 years, you can put 5 years, you can put 20 years, you can put anything. So it's a particular system which is to disempower ordinary citizens, which is why the effort they are putting is to say, is a referendum a must or is a referendum not a must? The answer is that a referendum is a must. It is a must politically. It is a must legally. Now, I am afraid that the current debate seems to be focusing on a referendum being a must by legal means. It must be a must by political means. You cannot have a constitution. When we had the 2000 referendum, there was no legal provision that demanded that there be a referendum. There was no constitutional provision that said that there must be a referendum. But we all knew that because it's a constitution, it's a fundamental law, it's about fundamental principle, involve the people. President Mugabe himself accepted the concept of a referendum without being forced by a constitutional provision, which is the same thing that happened in 2013. There was no constitutional provision which said we had to have a referendum. Now, how can it be that in 2025, 2026, you actually have constitutional provisions that require a referendum? Then you somewhat find some time to even put an idea that it can happen. Even if it were to be legally possible to do so without a referendum, it is politically impossible and politically unacceptable to have any such change happening without a referendum. And not just a referendum, without public participation, which takes me to the way they reacted to the SAPES convening of all the activities. That why would you have a bomb attack? Why would you have police officers simply taking over the premises of a private entity? Or why you break up a press conference by fellow colleagues or politicians and so forth? Why do so? It's actually based on the basis is that it is not about the people. Now, why would we have every day this idea that there should be no referendum? It's clear that they want to move far away from the ordinary people deciding the future of the country. So I have deliberately, Professor Mandaza, not wanted to go to the legal niceties, because there you have so many people that have expressed views on these things. But because we are not going to leave out these things, we are going to fight this. It is a real challenge that must be fought on every front. Political front, people must mobilize against. Legally, whatever the little space we have legally, we must still fight them. So we are not going to share publicly the nice legal arguments against their proposals, because I'm sure they're having some fishing expedition where they will throw in legal arguments which must be responded to, so that ultimately they settle on closing legal loopholes here and there. That is not going to happen. But I can easily say that what is being suggested cannot be done in the manner that is being proposed. And the simplest one, which even a person who is not a lawyer must appreciate this: you go to an election on the basis that those people who are seeking a mandate of the people are seeking a 5-year mandate. There was no doubt in the mind of everyone who was in the 2023 elections. Whether you were a councillor, an MP, or a president, you knew that you were saying to people, please give me 5 years. And in the next 5 years, I will do this. Then you get the mandate on the basis of a 5-year term. You then say that to extend that term, which you are given by the people, I don't want to go to the people. I want to go to other people who will be sitting at somewhere at a corner, and these people have nothing, because the president was not elected by parliament. So parliament has no role in determining the length or whatever is being argued about the president. The parliament and the president, they were elected at the same time. They are both deriving their mandate from the people. Each one has to go back to the people, whatever they want. So it will be politically unacceptable for the president himself. I'm not referring to anyone. I'm referring to President Mnangagwa himself. He cannot say, after getting a mandate from the people, because that is where he's accountable, he's responsible to the people. They gave him 5 years. If he wants more than 5 years, he must go back to them. That's quite straightforward. Does it require a law to say such an obvious point? It requires simple political morality. I will call that expression political morality. It's obvious. So the danger we face is that any politician who disregards the mandate that they were given by the people will be actually committing a very serious political offense. I'm not sure what name to give it. But if you get 5 years from the people, if you respect the people, you go back to the people. So at the very least, he would have to go back to them and then say, no, 5 years is not enough. I'm now at this stage. The arguments that are being made by the ZANU-PF conference, the ones, that's where I was talking about the loudest noise. Those people would then say, look, we've heard that and that and that. Yet, I'm sure you should guide me up closely. Yet, I want to say again that from the long period that we have been in this struggle as Zimbabweans, there are certain things we should not give up. The first one is that we limit the terms of our leaders. It was a huge achievement in 2013 to get that. But we got it after 33 years under one person, who then managed to get an extra 4 years. He couldn't finish the 5 years. So we had 37 years under President Mugabe. We can only have 10 years and a few months, the ones that they obtained, the finishing President Mugabe under President Mnangagwa. And I would want to agree with his position that he is a constitutionalist. Surely, no matter what, he should end there. Let's see what happens with other things. I think this is a very common framework. We stand to benefit more as a country from the principle that terms of office of our public leaders are limited. We must also gain much from the principle that certain things cannot be done by elected leaders. They would require the people themselves. We need to entrench that, and we must fight for it. Certain things cannot be done. I don't want to sound brainwashed, but I did follow the Brexit debate in England or in the UK the other time when they could simply agree that you entered the EU, you want to get out of the EU. Simply cannot be a decision of the government of the day. You must go to a referendum. And ordinary people must decide those. Certain questions must remain for the people. And one such question would be this: anything that changes. So we're not saying that the constitution cannot be changed, but it cannot be initiated at the instance of those that. Finally, I want to refer to what has been called the Chiwenga Challenge. And you forgive me if I go astray there. It's a mistake that we Zimbabweans are repeating. This is a mistake that was in 2017. When people were fighting President Mugabe, they picked on his deputy. And he became like the front runner. Everyone enjoyed the president going away, I think, for 2 weeks and saying, I'll be back in 2 weeks. That became like a heroic statement. And we forgot that this is one system that is renewing itself. So we are not sure about what is called the Chiwenga Challenge. Myself, I am not involved in, I don't know what's happening, but I think that Zimbabweans must not be obsessed with this thing. It is a time that this country benefits more from a total replacement of ZANU-PF. That is the ambitious goal that people must have, which is to say that if we come to the end of the term of the president in 2028, if we have the best of ways, we should have a new government that is not a ZANU-PF government. I hope that would be my presentation. I'm not sure whether my time can still allow, but my point is clear, Professor Manders. I would say that the challenge we face is a real challenge for Zimbabweans. It requires Zimbabweans to confront ZANU-PF. They must not give up on certain fundamental frameworks, the limited term of office, the power of the people to decide certain things must remain with the people. And that we must not be cheated by wanting to find change within ZANU-PF, which is why I would think that the Chiwenga Challenge, no matter how big it is or how small, it shouldn't be the basic focus because we will repeat the same thing. I think that he will merely start from where President Mnangagwa would have left if he's again assisted by the people to get there. And doesn't help to focus on it. I think we must help more. How do we get ZANU-PF out of power? Should remain the main challenge. And that is what we should deal with at the moment. And I think that less of the legal arguments will be made in court when the time comes. The best thing for Zimbabweans to say that what is being proposed by ZANU-PF is both politically unacceptable and legally unsustainable. Legally, they will fail. Politically, it's unacceptable. Now, when we say they will fail, we need Zimbabweans to know that it depends on what the courts will say. So even the most nonsensical legal argument may succeed if a court chooses that nonsense. So people must not rely more on legal niceties. I hope even in the discussions, moderator, if this point can keep coming out, we can have the best legal arguments. But at the end, the legal argument which will prevail is the legal argument that the Constitutional Court will pick, or the legal argument that the Constitutional Court will pursue. And so that's where legal arguments end. But political arguments do not end. They remain with us. We must continue to fight. That will be my presentation, and thank you very much.
Yeah, towards the end of it, Professor Madhuku, we'll be coming back to you, and immediately I have just two questions. The first is, of course, is it a question of getting ZANU-PF out of power, or the question of reforming the Zimbabwean state?
I believe it's clear. I think that it is a question of reforming the Zimbabwean state. We have to deal. This is what the constitutional reform movement was all about. The democratic struggles that, but we always hijack our movements. At the end, they narrow themselves to, replacement of governments. But we have always carried these things alongside each other and said that you can only, when I say that we remove ZANU-PF as a stepping stone to the reforming the state. So if we were to list the kind of steps we must go through to get the reforms, reforming the Zimbabwean state, you would have to step on the ZANU-PF removal and get to the next, so that whichever non-ZANU-PF government comes in, it is not coming in to simply continue from where ZANU-PF has left. It is coming in as part and parcel of a broader project to reform the state.
But Professor Madhuku, where is this madness coming from? This conscious disdain for constitutionalism, which is implicit in the whole 2030, 2035, if you add the Jonathan Moyo and others who have come on the bandwagon. What is it that has made this people so obsessive, at least those who are for this extension? What is it? Is it to do with some kind of purely retention of power, or is it something else? We are hearing here that there is some kind of a runganga, spiritualism, the Mutapa syndrome, the empire, new empire. We laugh at it, but I believe this is what is inspiring this. You call it nonsense. Ngaruvu may call it nonsense. Yes, it sounds nonsense, but it's serious. When you see any opposition to it, such as we saw on Tuesday, is met with violence. An indication that we are in for a bloody period ahead of us. These guys are prepared to kill for this 2030, 2035 agenda. What is it?
Thank you. I think it's a difficult question, but my answer would be very simple. I would obviously be corrected by those who know better. I think that it lies in what the state does and what instrumentation the state is, what you can put the state to. The state is used as an instrument of, what is maybe still be described in the Marxian sense of primitive accumulation of wealth. So once you get control of the state, then you have at your disposal the wealth that you need. That is at the center of it all. It is to be able to remain in control of the state, which we deploy for that central issue. It can't be just simply the love of power. I'm sure that people get tired of it and so on. And this is where it is coming from. So the state is in the control of a few individuals who would then use it for all sorts of things, but that lying beneath would be accumulation of wealth.
You have answered into retention of the wealth, protection of wealth, and therefore the need to die in office. You have answered me. I'll come back to you. Before I go to justice, just to indicate to yourselves that we have probably the highest turnout of the last year today. We have 445, almost 500 people now, right now. That's a reflection of the interest that this topic has provoked, but also must add, also it's a reaction or a response to the fine minds that we have on this platform, including yourself, Professor Madhuku.
Thank you.
So we feel inspired at the fact that there's so much interest in this subject. It is something that highlights or underpins the point you made earlier on, that you cannot just do things without people. You know, people are opposed to this, and that I think those concerned must know that. Asifambe, Basinavan. Yeah. So the justice, please come in. Justice. Is justice there? Justice. David. David. I'm sorry about this, Professor Madhuku. I don't know what's happening.
That's fine.
Justice. David. But how do you think this is going to pan out in the next few weeks, months, Professor Madhuku?
Well, I think for the others to get connected.
Yeah.
One thing I find is that there are likely to be two developments. The first development in which we are beginning to see is a growing consciousness that what is being proposed is unacceptable. There is an inner searching in many of our Zimbabweans who say, well, I think this time I need to be counted. Why is it happening? And is it not that we are being disrespected? So I am seeing a growing consciousness among Zimbabweans, and that just like you have observed that there's such interest, it might be easier this time around to get support for the opposition to this than it was before. So it's likely to ignite, further and more interest and more focus on trying to oppose what's going on. So that is one side. On the other side, it's not going to have to the strengthening of ZANU-PF. I think that in the next few weeks, there will be an element of doubt on the ZANU-PF movers of the 2030 agenda. And that moment of doubt is growing with the desperate efforts that we saw. I mean, the bombing, the intimidation, the trying to breaking up meetings, and so on. It's actually a sign of doubt. And then I think I also saw some statement where the Minister of Justice was trying to clarify some document which was circulating, where he made a very important statement that we still have not yet decided the nature of the amendments, but as soon as the powers that be, as soon as they've decided on that, we will communicate and we will be transparent about it. So on the side of ZANU-PF, it's going to be an issue which requires that people then take advantage of. I don't believe that, I may be wrong, that ZANU-PF would even be stronger in the coming weeks. I think the divisions in ZANU are going to strengthen. Those that were against the 2030 agenda within ZANU-PF are likely to be strengthened by what appears to be, massive support for the anti-2030 agenda.
But you know yourself from your history, political history, that it was the NCA movement the constitutional movement that led to the Constitutional Commission of 2000 and brought the whole subject of the Constitution to the people. But now, we are now in a different set of circumstances, one in which the formal opposition that we have known for last 20 years is no more. It's an amorphous lot, a ragtag bunch of MPs in parliament, people who are completely, I don't know, largely, for lack of better words, moribund. And so where's the agency through which to fight this madness? An attempt by a group of activists on Tuesday met with the bombings, you know. It appears that the system is quite happy in having a vacuum in the form of an opposition, and I intend on ensuring that the opposition doesn't put up his head again. What shall we do?
Well, I think that these things would happen. The mere fact that there is all the problems that we are facing, that the opposition in parliament has been rendered ineffective. It is an opportunity for renewal. We shouldn't even lose hope. The opposition developed up to the stage where it could have such a presence in parliament. That thing started in 2000. And then at the moment it has reached where it is no longer useful. The MPs are no longer doing that which they are supposed to do. It would be an opportunity for Zimbabweans to regroup, not just regrouping in the sense of the old players. I have no doubt in my mind that the kind of irritation that is coming from the 2030 agenda, coupled with the problems that the country continues to face in terms of, lack of economic productivity that will be able to absorb most of our young people in jobs and, proper economic means that have to develop. I think that people must not lose hope. One of these days you begin to see issues that are coming. Perhaps I need to let you know that I'm reading that Justice Mavezenge says he needs just to be added. He's still in the backstage, so I'm sure your organizers can do that.
Okay, Justice, can you come in now? David and Tony. What's going on there? David. I don't know what's happened to technology today. Hello?
Hi.
Yeah, where's Justice?
I don't know what's going on.
Where's Justice?
I don't know. I'm liaising with David and...
Is Tendai there? Tendai Mbofana? Hello? Tendai?
Justice says he's there. He keeps putting a message that he says, I'm here. He's at the backstage.
David?
And I think Tendai also writing a message saying that Tendai Ruben Mbofana is saying, I've also been waiting in the backstage to be added. So I think it's a technology issue.
Yeah, I think there's a problem somewhere. Now, the question I asked earlier on, Tejara, that I agree with you on the so-called Chiwenga challenge, because it also suggests a kind of obliviousness to the lack of constitutionalism, or to put it more bluntly, there appears to be a reluctance to recognize that the coup needs to be cured in terms of constitutionalism. But we have a situation where even the opposition celebrated the breach of the constitution in 2017. What's your comment on that?
Okay, thank you. In fact, it's a problem that comes from lack of depth in all of us regarding constitutionalism. If we fight our struggle in such a way that we end up identifying with individuals and so forth, and say that it is so and so who is wrong. In other words, we then focused the struggle at that stage more out of listening to internal ZANU-PF politics. So everyone thought that the issue was all about Mugabe going and when he was to go. And then we forgot that he was part of a system. So when it was time for us to be mobilized, we are now removing Mugabe. People forgot, and then as long as Mugabe was going, we didn't care about the means that were to be used. And that was a mistake. We ought not have allowed such a situation where you would make a replacement out of that. We ought, at the very least, to have pushed for an election, either an early election, at the very least. And that is what ought to have happened. So you can only cure 2017. I cannot say we can only cure, but you have to ensure that 2017 is not repeated. In other words, we shouldn't believe that whenever we reach such a situation, it is about someone else, because those many people who support the Chiwenga challenge somewhat believe miraculously that as long as he's portrayed as the challenger who is being frustrated, he will find a way of removing Emerson, Mnangagwa, and so on, which is wrong in itself.
And even if it's unconstitutional, in inverted commas.
Yes, that's what we shouldn't have a situation like that. I think we should defend. When we defend the Constitution, we defend in all respects. Now we're saying you need a referendum. You cannot have an amendment which benefits the incumbent. All these are constitutional principles, and alongside those principles must be the principle that even taking over must be in terms of what the current Constitution provides. So you must have reform, provide for real, genuine democratic reforms in terms of free and fair elections is what you require. When you run an election, you need free and fair processes, and there's so many things that need to be reformed in our system.
But you are also aware of the kind of debate or discourse around the proposed National Transitional Authority, based on the view that the Zimbabwean state, over the last 20 years has demonstrated a lack of capacity to reform, and that now, even with this 2030 thing, that we need an interventionist instrument. What is your view on the discussion around the Transitional Authority?
Yes, I think my view on that is I support the notion that you need reform, that you need change which goes fundamentally to change everything that has been.
Okay.
Yeah. But do you see that feasible?
Well, it will not be feasible in the short term.
Yeah.
Because then certainly you need to put in place a more extensive buy-in from ordinary people and so forth. So in the short term, it won't be feasible in the short term. It's something that will have to happen in the long term by engaging all the key players, particularly by sticking to the fact that certain principles ought to be respected of the Constitution.
Yes. Okay, Justice has emerged. Justice, welcome. I'm so sorry about the technology tonight. I don't know what it is. Of course, after the bombing on Tuesday, our Wi-Fi system was destroyed completely. It was burnt.
I'm sorry about that.
We tried to replace it this afternoon with a new.
No, that's okay.
Yeah,
that's okay.
I'm sorry about that, but
no problem.
Very embarrassing. We have the highest turnout. I was just telling Professor Madhuku, we have the highest turnout, almost 500 people on this platform right now.
No, I was following. I could hear everything, but I was in the backstage.
So take up from where Professor has left off. It's really the question which I was asking of him.
Yeah.
What's the likely trajectory if we accept, as Professor Madhuku has said, that this thing has to be fought? One needs the requisite agency through which to fight it, but in the context not just of personalizing thing around Mnangagwa, but also the reform of the state. What is your view?
Yeah. So first, Thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation, and I'm very grateful that I'm speaking after Professor Madhuku because he laid sufficient ground, I think, for a robust conversation on this, and I agree with most of the things that he said. But I wanted to start my presentation from the question you asked. Why 2030 agenda? Why extend the term? And I just want to expand on what Professor Madhuku has already mentioned. One of the issues that we need to pay attention to as a country is that there are a few Zimbabweans who are using the Zimbabwean state as a vehicle of extracting minerals, including gold and diamonds, not only from Zimbabwe, but from countries that surround us, particularly the countries that are involved in conflict. I've just finished a mission, and it was said for me to learn about the role that some people in our country are playing in places like the Congo, the DRC Congo, the Eastern DRC, the role they are playing in South Sudan and Sudan itself. So for those people remaining in charge of the Zimbabwean state is very important because that is the vehicle they are using to loot, not just from Zimbabwe, but from those countries as well. So Professor Madhuku is very right that the president is perceived as a front to control the state so that they can continue to loot not only from Zimbabwe, but from those countries that I mentioned. But we must then understand what the problem is with the 2030 agenda and so forth. So the starting point for me is to appreciate or to make a comment about the significance of public debates such as the one that we are having right now. My view is that those who are behind the 2030 agenda are very vulnerable, and they wish to win their argument in the court of public opinion first. They are very desperate to win the argument in the court of public opinion first, even without going to a referendum. They know very well that their legal arguments in support of extending President Mnangagwa's term are illegal. They are unlawful. They are a nullity. So Professor Madhuku is correct. They know these people. But what they are trying to do is to create confusion, but also create doubt and create a situation where the public or a significant part of the public can, for some reason, accept that there's a constitutional lacuna, or there's a lacuna in the constitution. And therefore, what is being suggested is something that is permissible. For me, this is exactly why they are desperate to silence the voices of those who are opposing this agenda or who are trying to expose the illegitimacy of this agenda. This explains the violence, the bombings that have taken place at your place, Professor Mandaza, and the violence that is going on around the country, targeting people who are being vocal in opposing this agenda. But also for me, that's exactly why people like Jonathan Moyo are being alleged to be fronting this. And I think it's no longer an allegation. When you look at what he says, clearly is one of the vocal people on this. Jonathan Moyo is not a lawyer to develop any legal argument. He's not qualified to do that. But Jonathan Moyo is a propagandist. He's very qualified at that. His expertise is that of a propagandist. And it's not by coincidence that he is the one who is being seen as, fronting these documents and pushing these documents, and even pushing the narrative in the form of legal opinions and so forth. The agenda is to win in the court of public opinion. So Professor Madhuku is quite correct that this is a political fight more than a legal fight. However, I still think that it is important to demonstrate the legal illegitimacy, or rather to demonstrate the illegality before we even go to the court of law. It's very important because that is the only way we can be pushed back against their agenda to win in the court of public opinion. Because the more we refrain from engaging with them pound for pound and in granular details to expose the fallacy of the argument, even in the law, then we risk a scenario where they create confusion in the public, in the court of public opinion. And as I will demonstrate later in my presentation, they will go to court, and as Professor Madhuku rightly mentioned, it is possible that the court will endorse whatever nonsense that they bring. So I think it is very important to meet them pound for pound in the court of public opinion and expose the political fallacy of the argument, as Professor Madhuku has done, but also expose even the illegality of the problem. Now, what I intend to do is to then try and offer some views that may help us to try and understand the ZANU-PF internal dynamics, so that we are then able to understand what we are up against. It is my view that the 2030 agenda is not being driven by a faction. I think we have heard in the past people saying referring to the 2030 group as a faction. I don't think they are a faction. I think they are some kind of a group, but which has factions inside it. And for me, there are two distinct factions rather, that are in the 2030 agenda. And it is important to understand these factions so that we know how to engage. For me, the first faction is the one that I would characterize as the temporary succession faction. This is the group that was quite vocal. And I believe that this is the group that actually started the campaign. They perceive this campaign as Chinu Chavo. Their idea, I believe, was to secure a third term for Idi Mnangagwa without amending the constitution. I say this because if you recall, after Bulawayo, people like, I don't know if he is still, but that time he was Harare ZANU-PF chairperson, Masimirembwa, addressing rallies and groups and saying, we are going to get a third term for the president without amending the constitution, without going to a referendum. So there's no need for all that. And I did an opinion, an op-ed rather, sometime in January, where I tried to engage with that reasoning and say, but what do they mean when they say we will get a third term for the president without touching the constitution? And I thought that this group seeks to persuade ED to resign from office before hitting 3 years into his current term, and then get him to bounce back in 2028 as a ZANU-PF presidential candidate. I still think this was the original idea amongst those who started the 2030 campaign. And the legal basis for that,
you'd leave office and come back in 2020.
Leave office before September the 6th, before 6 September 2026. Leave office and run the state from the ZANU-PF party, because when he leaves office, he still remains first secretary of the party or party president.
And then who's president in the meantime?
Hang on, let me show you. But what is the legal basis for that? The legal basis for that is Section 91, 2 of the Constitution, which says for one to be considered to have served a full term, for the president to be considered to have served a full term, they must have served 3 years or more. Idi Mnangagwa reaches 3 years on the 6th of September 2026. So from 6 September 2026, he is then considered to have served a full term under the Zimbabwean Constitution and becomes disqualified for standing in any future presidential elections. And I thought that what they wanted to do was to persuade him to resign before the 6th of September 2026 and replace him with a titular or a stooge president. Because once he resigns, ZANU-PF will have to find a successor for all of us. Now, this is why, in my view, when you read the resolution to extend the president's term when it was fashioned in Bulawayo in 2024, it was resolution number 1. Do you know what was resolution number 2? Resolution number 2 was a resolution on party supremacy. In other words, ZANU-PF said in Bulawayo, they need to put in place a framework to ensure that from now onwards, the party would be more supreme compared to the government. I understood that to be a way of trying to enable ED to be able to run the government from the party, with someone in the office of the president being just a stooge. And in my view, this is why at the beginning of the year, or rather at the end of the year last year, we began to see some conversations, some robust conversations around reconfiguring not just the way the party administration is being run, but also the way the office of the deputy president or the vice president is currently constituted. Kempo Mohadi, whom for quite some time we never saw until 2024, around November, he came back and was quite visible. But also we started seeing some characters, and maybe it's not important to name names at this point, but some characters within ZANU-PF positioning themselves as potential titular presidents. And I believe Chris Mtswangwa himself had those ambitions, and still has those ambitions. But then it is my reading that that strategy was hijacked by Shigananda. Again, I encourage the audience.
That's the second faction you're talking about. The second faction?
Yes, I'm moving to the second faction.
Yes.
I encourage the audience, Professor Mandaza, to question who Shiganandas are. Because there is this idea that Shiganandas are the people who are behind the 2030 agenda. I do think that Shiganandas are people who are not necessarily in one faction of the 2030 agenda, but they have actually, I believe that they have actually inserted themselves into the 2030 agenda, and they've been able to actually hijack it from those who considered themselves the Nevechin, the likes of Chris Mtswangwa. This is why, if you recall, when we started seeing from the beginning of this year Tagwire being fronted as someone who could potentially be a successor.
Mm.
And even some of the people who were pro 2030 were opposed to the idea of Kudakwashi Tagwire being admitted into ZANU-PF Central Committee. Why?
Mhm.
Because they knew that this was an attempt to hijack a process which they thought they were in control of. And unfortunately, it appears that they've to some extent lost the battle, because Kudakwashi Tagwire is now part of the Central Committee. He's being, for all intents and purposes, being touted as a potential vice president. But there's a whole group of people who feel very vulnerable about that. Because remember, and this is not gossip, remember Chris Mtwangwa in one of his addresses talks about how he left cabinet, or he lost his position as presidential advisor. And he says himself, he lost that position because of Kudakwashi Tagwire and General Chiwenga. It's him who says that. It's not me. Which means that the relationship between Kudakwashi Tagwire and Mutwangwa has been frosty. And many people question, how is it that Mutwangwa made a somersault and began to support Kudakwashi Tagwire's entry into the Central Committee? But Mutwangwa has not made a somersault. Mutwangwa consistently says, even in his last press conference, he consistently says he welcomes Kudakwashi and hopes that he has no other agendas. He keeps on saying that, which to me is a demonstration of this discomfort with the idea that Kudakwashi Tagwire could potentially be parachuted and become this titular president to hold office between 6 September 2026 and March 2028, when the next general election is coming.
How do you reconcile that, Justice? How do you reconcile that conclusion you just made, and the one which I referred to when I was speaking to Professor Madhuku, the Mutapa Empire syndrome, the view that Emerson wants to crown himself the Mutapa and die in office.
So those who are behind the 2030 agenda, all the factions, all of them, they are very much aware of President Mnangagwa's vulnerability, particularly the fact that he has this desire to hang on. He has this desire to mutate into some kind of an emperor, Munumutapa. Yeah. They are aware of that. And they are competing to find ways to use that vulnerability for their own purposes. So those who are extracting gold, diamonds from Zimbabwe and also from neighboring countries are seeking to appeal to Mnangagwa's idea of an emperor, so that they can continue to front him in office and they can continue to loot. But also, some of the members of the party, I believe, including Chris, generally have ambitions to succeed Mnangagwa. And in order to do so, they believe that the best way to succeed Mnangagwa is to massage his ego until they can be accepted into the presidium. So that's how I would answer that. But allow me to then move to the second faction, which I characterize as the deemed provision faction. So in the last 3 months, we have then been bombarded by this legal opinion allegedly fronted by Jonathan Moy, which basically says we can postpone the next election through extending the current term of office of the president, right? And my view is those who are uncomfortable about Taguirei becoming the temporary successor might be the ones who were actually responsible for outsourcing this legal opinion, because they still want to find a way of extending E.D. Mnangagwa's term to beyond 2030, but without having Taguirei or any of the Taguirei-related faction members occupying the office of the vice president, because that would be disastrous for the Mutsvangwas and others. So it is my belief that they then outsourced this idea of an opinion on how else the 2030 agenda can be achieved. And this is now how we have come to this deemed provision faction, which basically seeks to achieve to extend Mnangagwa's term through a constitutional amendment, which increases the term of office for Mnangagwa from 5 to 7 years.
What's the rationale for that?
Now I'm heading there. Just work with me for a moment. They seem to argue, the deemed provision faction, fronted by your Jonathan Moyes and so forth, they seem to argue that such an amendment is not an extension of the term of office because the president will still be serving 2 terms. Just that his last term will be 7 years and not 5 years. So that's their reasoning. That, look, the president is still confined to 2 terms. It's just that 1 term is now 7 years instead of 5 years. They base their argument on a misinterpretation of what the Constitutional Court, or rather the Supreme Court, said in a judgment of, a judgment popularly known as Mupungu. If you read Jonathan Moyo's tweets and so forth, he frets about this judgment, the Mupungu judgment. So the Mupungu judgment, for the sake of our audience, Professor Ibo Mandas, the Mupungu judgment is the judgment which was handed down by the Supreme Court when there was a challenge to the decision to extend Chief Justice Luke Malaba's term of office. I think everyone remembers that episode. So the Supreme Court came up with some kind of a very strange interpretation of term limits. Bharat Patel is the one who led the writing of that judgment, and he argues, or rather he holds or he ruled that when you look at the term of office for the Chief Justice and the judges, right, it is limited to 15 years, right, provided one is still below a certain age. And what Bharat Patel did in that judgment is to then say there's a difference between an age limit and a term limit. And he says the term limit for a Constitutional Court judge is 15 years. The age limit was 70 years. So what the president did when he extended Malaba's term is he changed the age limit. He did not touch the term limit. It's a very strange reasoning for me, but that is the jurisprudence we have, and that is the law we have, right? So that misinterpretation of the Mupungu judgment is what is driving Jonathan Moyo and all these other people to then argue that you can have a term of office for the president remaining 2 terms, but extending one of the terms from 5 to 7. But here is their challenge, which is why I said it's a misreading of the Mupungu judgment. So while this, I believe that the court in Mupungu got this extremely wrong, there is something they got right, which is at page 50 to page 51. A good friend of mine, Doug Coulthard, alerted me to that action. at page 50 to 51 of the judgment, where the court says Section 95(2) of the Constitution imposes a term limit, and that term limit is 5 years. That is what the court says. The court also says any amendment of the Constitution which seeks to increase the term from 5 years must be ratified through a referendum, as Professor Madhuku alluded to earlier on. So that is the legal challenge that the deed provision faction is confronted with. Now, to land on my presentation, what are the possible scenarios that we should anticipate going forward?
Yes.
And again, I could be wrong, but I'm just sharing my views from what I'm seeing obtaining. So I think, number one, we must understand that President Mnangagwa is waiting to be persuaded by the different factions. Remember, you talked about the Mutapa syndrome. It's also part of it. It's also part of it where you sit and you enjoy to see people competing to come up with ideas on how you can actually translate into an empire. So he is waiting to be persuaded, and he said it at a press conference at a press briefing with, or rather at a meeting with editors sometime last year. He said, let them persuade me. And he said, I will persuade persuaders, in ambiguous things. So I believe he is waiting to be persuaded by the different factions. But it appears that he wants an approach that does not violate the Constitution in a brazen way. I think the word, the phrase to underline there is in a brazen way. He doesn't mind a violation of the Constitution. Like Professor Madhuku mentioned earlier on, he is part of the gang of leaders whom we have had since 1980, who never contributed to any democratic development or strengthening of any democratic mechanisms in our country. But he does not want an approach which, in a brazen way, he wants something
I don't understand that argument at all, because basically the whole 2030 agenda is brazen already. Okay.
Yeah, but the levels of
what's in the public domain is not the factional arguments that you refer to, as important as they may be. And what's central in your argument that the 2030 agenda, the Emperor Mutapa agenda, is the constant factor. But I'll remember, put it to you, unless there's agency, there's organized opposition to this thing, it's a fait accompli that Emerson will go through on the 2030 agenda. There's nothing to stop him. There's nothing. The constitutions. I'm not a constitutional lawyer by any standards, but I think that it's facile to highlight or emphasize the importance of constitutions against a background where constitutions have been ignored. Where right now we are under a coup government, right? Which is a fundamental breach of the Constitution. What stops this regime from tearing the Constitution up altogether? What is it? It can only be in your imagination as the constitutional lawyers arguing the way you are arguing.
Work with me for a moment. Yes. So when I'm talking about a Brazil, I'm talking about. I'm essentially reading what Emerson means when he says, I am a constitutionalist. I will go. I know when I'm supposed to go. So when he says he's a constitutionalist, I believe that what he means is he wants a way of extending his term of office, which somehow can be legitimated. Right, and there are reasons why, and I'm going to point to them in a moment. Why he needs that? Why he can't just proceed without any care? So that's the first. The second scenario, which will go hand in hand with the first one that I mentioned, is the mushrooming of legal opinions, right? To persuade not just ED, but also to create doubt amongst the public. I spoke about this earlier on. We've already started seeing it, even from unfamiliar quarters, from unfamiliar quarters, eminent lawyers coming up with all these legal opinions that are purely nonsense, as Professor Madhuku alluded earlier on. But the intention is to massage ED's ego. The intention is to confuse the public. The third aspect, which really explains why I said ED wants something that, though illegal, but looks somewhat justifiable, is we are likely to have another Jealous Mawarire moment. I'm sorry to use my brother Jealous Mawarire's name. I think in this discourse is one of the most progressive voices. But when I'm saying a Jealous Mawarire moment, I'm referring to the 2013 court application, which came from Norway for most of us, and actually created some of the problems that are affecting us today, where we woke up one day, someone went to court and challenged President Mnangagwa, President Mugabe, and sought the Supreme Court to order President Mugabe to hold an election before we had any reforms. I assume, or rather I can see, in not a long time from now, we might also have a sinister application coming before the Constitutional Court to try and sanitize what is going on. That application may come in the form of seeking an opinion from the court, or it may come after the amendments have been done. But I suspect that there might be a sinister application to seek the opinion of the court on some of these matters. The next scenario is escalated violence, and I think we need to prepare for that. Part of persuading ED Mnangagwa is to create an impression that there is no significant opposition to the 2030 agenda. That is part of massaging his ego. To say, President, look, people love you. You can go ahead with this idea and mutate into an emperor. This is why, again, is when I opened my address, I talked about why we are seeing this unnecessary, what appears like unnecessary forms of violence. They are meant to silence the country and create an impression that there is actually no significant opposition to ED Mnangagwa's idea of extending his term. I don't believe for a second that ED Mnangagwa thinks that people love him so much that he should remain in power. I don't think he even himself believes that. If he believed that, he would have no problems with going to a referendum. So he knows that he is unpopular.
Justice, to conclude here, on your part,
yeah.
What's the likely developments in the next few weeks, months?
No, I need to conclude with the military coup.
We have had people who opposed to this 2030 agenda denied a press conference in both Harare and Bulawayo. We have had the venue for that the Harare press conference bombed on Tuesday. Is a reflection of the seriousness of the 2030 agenda. What are the likely developments? So let's remember that this debate, the 2030 agenda, is really so far a ZANU PF discourse.
I don't think they can stop the discourse. I don't think they can succeed to stop. I don't think they can succeed to stop. We are already having the conversation right now. Yeah, so Zimbabweans, I think, will continue to oppose this nonsense. Yes. But it will lead to the last point that I wanted to make, which is the last scenario, which I think is a very dangerous scenario. it is likely that we will see another military coup. In terms of the Zimbabwean jurisprudence that we have at the moment, Professor Madhuku reminds us all the time that the law is what the court says it is. It is not what Justice or Ibo or any of these people say. It is what the court says. The court, in a case of Liberal Democrats versus President of Zimbabwe, a case where there was a challenge to the way President Mnangagwa came to power in 2017. That case was in the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court said the action that was taken by the military in 2017 is lawful. It's constitutionally valid because all the institutions that are supposed to safeguard democracy had been captured by President Mugabe's administration. What that does in a very dangerous way is that it creates legality for a coup in the event that they proceed with their 2030 agenda and go to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court endorses that. If there is sufficient rancor amongst the citizens, it is possible that there will be a military coup in Zimbabwe. And I am afraid to say, in terms of the jurisprudence that we have currently, that coup would be lawful. So I end there, but it would be another set.
In terms of the Chiweshe judgment.
So the Chiweshe judgment was in the High Court. The Chiweshe judgment was in the High Court. And then what the applicant in Liberal Democrats did is to launch a fresh challenge in the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court basically upheld the Chiweshe judgment in the High Court and said this is the law.
Just to elaborate, just briefly, what was the import of that ruling? Explain to the audience that the military has a right to intervene, right?
The import is very clear. It's that the military, in terms of the law that we have, the position outlined by the court, the military has the right to intervene when democratic institutions are captured and are no longer functional. So if the military feels that the institutions are captured, as they felt in 2017 November, the court in Liberal Democrats versus President of Zimbabwe says you can intervene. That's the import. And it's as scary as it is, but that is the import.
Okay. Right. Professor Madhuku, what have you got to say and a commentary on what just had to say just now, Professor Madhuku? I believe Bofana is gone. He is not connected at all. Professor Madhuku?
You probably need to bring him to the show because he's probably in the back stage.
David, can you bring Professor Madhuku in? David? David? It's a nightmare today.
So maybe while you are waiting for Professor Madhuku, because I'm seeing some of the comments here, Prof Mandaza. Look, when I'm talking about a military coup, so number one, I need to make it very clear that I'm not advocating for a coup. I'm simply explaining what the law says and the vulnerabilities that we have, which is the legacy of what? 2017. Right. So that's number one. Number two, I'm not saying, I'm not even attaching a probability of a coup, because that I think I leave to political scientists to sort of analyze and say what is the probability of a coup. I don't know. I'm simply saying the state is vulnerable because of the jurisprudence that the very same state has created. That's what I'm saying. I thought I needed to clarify that.
No, we hear you. I mean, the idea of or the possibility of a coup has always been in the offing in Zimbabwe right now. It is a possibility. But I'm just saying that from a legal or constitutional point of view, in inverted commas, a situation where a coup is no longer a coup in the jurisprudence of Zimbabwe, because it's saying that the military has the right to intervene.
Yes.
Crazy thing, and that's why some of my colleagues like Tony Rila have always talked about the need to cure the coup. Until the coup is cured, until the coup is cured, it's going to be very difficult to argue constitutionally on these matters. I don't know what Professor Madhuku can say to that. Carry on, Justice.
So perhaps the audience might also ask this question, Professor Mandas, but why should it matter that the law, like if someone mounts a coup, why do they need the law to be on their side? Because they are already overthrowing the law anyway. So why would they care about the law?
Yeah.
They do. From experience of coups in Zimbabwe, but also on the continent, they are in a lot of cases, those who overthrow governments always want to package it as something that is justifiable on the doctrine of necessity basis, to ensure that the region accepts. It's not necessarily to ensure that the citizens accept. No, it's to ensure that the region accepts. The reason why the region, SADC and the AU found it very difficult to respond to the Zimbabwean coup in the way that they have responded to Mali, to Burkina Faso, is because the Zimbabwean coup of 2017 was legitimized by the courts. And those who were behind the coup also used the arguments that Mugabe had used in the past to say, look, if the highest court or if the court says it is lawful, then who are you?
Don't go that way. We know that a coup is a
but
coup.
Professor is here.
A coup is a coup. Maybe Professor Madhuku is back. Professor Madhuku, please, what's your commentary on what Justice to say, including in particular the scenarios that he painted?
Yes, I just want to comment perhaps on the issue he has raised relating to the jurisprudence of a coup. In other words, the lawfulness of a coup. He is correct that the post-2017 scenario did create a situation where the courts came in, and when the courts came in, they gave what we may call judicial support or judicial approval of the coup that had taken place. It is actually known that if you go around the world, almost every coup seeks some judicial approval. And there are countries that have had to then stop this process. There is one country where a coup took place, the courts approved it, then the politicians started doing coups. Another coup came again, and the courts then had to say, no, a coup does not require judicial approval. It requires the approval of the people. I mean, the courts started changing. So this is what has happened in this case. If you read the judgment that he is referring to, after the Justice Chiweshe judgment was like a default judgment, was just given. It was a judgment that was not then argued, but it is the judgment by Chief Justice Malava, the one is talking about the Liberal Democrats one, where a lot of statements were said by the court in that judgment, which ought not have been said. But those statements will remain, where you would somewhat say that the army has, in certain circumstances, That's what Justice Chiweshe said, which is then endorsed by the Constitutional Court to say, well, the coup was made lawful. So it would mean that should there be a coup, if you line up the things properly, you get a coup. You also try and get a judgment that says your coup is lawful, and so on. I mean, it can become a very dangerous direction that the country will go in. So he is correct that far that could be one of the problems that people have in the country. Those who might want a coup can easily do it if they think they will be successful.
Yeah, but now, I mean, just to close off as we should, what's the likely trajectory in your view over this 2030 issue? How do you see the developments the next few weeks?
Yeah, for me, I think, well, perhaps here I'm speaking with optimism. I think that because of the extent to which they have gone, the ZANU-PF people who are pushing for the 2030 agenda will actually try and do something about it. They'll do something about it. They'll try and make their proposal see the light of day. Perhaps publish some document that will contain their proposals. Perhaps try and initiate a parliamentary process to amend the constitution. Now, because they themselves very keen in wanting, they might start by then sponsoring litigants. So we obviously are going to get some litigation in the courts, and the litigation in the courts would expect, if people are not careful, a litigant who goes to court without people realizing it, and then and with the hope that that person will come out of a court with a judgment that says no, it's perfectly proper to do that. That is what they will attempt, but I think that they will not succeed. But that's my view. This is really my personal view. Justice was putting a lot, and I agree with him. I was going to forget. I agree with him that wherever possible, this debate on legal arguments must still continue so that you delegitimize the popular, because those who put in legal arguments to say it's proper, the Constitution allows it, they're not focusing on the law. They are focusing on the broader public to convince the public that there's nothing wrong with it. So they must be fought in that terrain as well. So we are likely to see those two, in fact, three movements. One that tries to initiate a parliamentary process where Parliament will then be called upon to be debating that. Secondly, some movement in the courts with issues. And then, of course, thirdly, there will also be more activism from those who are opposed to the process, because that opposition is very strong. And the overreaction we saw at the beginning of the week with the bombing at Sapes and then the attempt to stop, it is likely to go in a direction where we might get some political heat being generated in the next few weeks, because certainly many Zimbabweans will not just allow it. It won't be business as usual. So there's going to be some political activism. But ultimately, I think that the 2030 agenda will fail. I mean, to the extent that it is an agenda meant to end up with 2028 no elections, and we simply have the president go. I mean, that is likely to fail. That's my projection.
Well, there's also an argument, Professor Madhuku and Justice, that the 2030 agenda is largely about succession. Okay. Firstly, to preempt Chiwenga, clearly, put him out of the race, and secondly, to ensure that someone other than Chiwenga takes over should anything happen to Mnangagwa. You must agree. We have to agree that Mnangagwa's calculation and the calculation of those that support him, it suggests he's immortal as Mugabe thought he was. And wanted to rule for life. Yeah, anything can happen to Mnangagwa. He's not a young man. And therefore, the argument here is that the Tagwire factor is intended as a kind of a security of succession, in a manner in which that would also safeguard the interests of Emerson and his family, and of course the interests of Tagwire himself. What's your view on that?
Well, I wanted to say that I've heard so many people talk about all these things on whether one calls it a succession framework and so on. I think, in my view, it's a problem for us. When I did refer to the Chiwenga challenge, the real issue that must emerge now is we as Zimbabweans must get out of trying to analyze our future as a country on the basis of the going in on within ZANU-PF. I'm sure they can make as many arrangements as they have. They can plan around as much as they can. But as far as I'm concerned, I think that the 2030 agenda still remains what we have indicated, that those who are interested in maintaining the control of the state to their own thing. So what is going to happen is the fight to stop them going, to stop the 2030 agenda is likely to bring in a coalition of various forces to stop it. Ultimately, we will have elections. That's what I think. We are still likely to have elections in 2028. And that ZANU-PF would end up with the candidates that it has always had, the kind of people that it has. I don't think ZANU-PF is now ready for the kind of change that is suggested by Kudakwashe Tagwire becoming. I'm not sure where it is coming from, but we saw the resistance that he faced in trying to be a member of the Central Committee. So there was a fight there. But one should not take them. I'm now here, unfortunately, forced to say things that I'm normally not interested in. What in ZANU, within ZANU-PF, what we then saw is that victory, which is, if we call it so, where he's then a member of the Central Committee. But we cannot just suddenly think that those who were fighting Tagwire, for whatever reason, think that they have lost. I don't think they have lost at all. They are busy planning and so on. And as long as the Chiwengas and others are there, it will be very difficult for ZANU-PF, whether it's 2028 or 2030, to give to persons that are not from the establishment. Because the Tagwires are very, I mean, it will be a big change. I don't think they will be able to survive beyond if they get power, where there's a baton from the president. Let's say he gets it and says he's the president. That would be a totally different Zimbabwe. And that I don't think he will have the style that we saw with that bomb at Sapes is the old order. That attempt that you can't even allow a press conference is I'm calling old order, the real ZANU-PF as we know it. Any of these new people that will come in may not be able to sustain that sort of framework. I don't know whether they are schooled in that. So I believe that at the end of the day, ZANU-PF will fail in its shenanigans, and we should be looking forward to ZANU-PF under the old system.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm also surprised that you think that the election route is still a viable route in Zimbabwe. It's only 3 years away, when elections have been a disaster. And that's why some of us have been pushing the NT idea. I mean, there's been no free and fair election since 2000. So what do we expect? Why should we look forward to another election? Justice.
Well, I don't see easily how we could. I mean, like I said earlier on, the transitional authority in the short term it faces problems. I think in the long term is an idea that should be pursued. In the short term, as we fight the attempts at 2030, we only have to fall back on an election route, because our major argument is that you can't do these things. That's undemocratic. That perhaps then as a transition from there, you could move. All we have to do is that we should not accept a situation where the ZANU-PF 2030 people impose their will on the people.
Yes, but also simultaneously, we should agree on an intervention which ensures that the next elections don't take place before there are reforms.
Yes,
Justice,
I
what
agree
do you
with
think of
you.
that? Yes. Justice, your last word?
Yeah. I certainly agree with you that the 2030 agenda is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity, I think, for Zimbabweans to rethink the way they engage in these struggles. I like very much the exchange that you had with Professor Madhuku earlier on before I came in about not losing. Professor Madhuku's point was the mistake we've always made historically is to think that if we change governments or we change individuals, our problems will disappear, right?
Yes.
And certainly that's not what happens. And now this is why people are thinking, okay, maybe if we have Chiwenga, if we have this, we'll be fine. No, the idea is we need to reform the state.
Yes.
So we must oppose the 2030 agenda first and foremost to defend the principle that Zimbabweans should have an opportunity to determine whether and how they elect their national leadership.
Yes.
But the conversation needs to be enriched further.
Mhm.
And depending on opportunities that arise in the way that we engage in this struggle against 2030, then I think we should discuss the substantive reforms that are needed.
Yes.
So, in other words, I'm simply proposing that, and in agreement with other voices, that first we must defend the Constitution, but in defending the Constitution, we need not to just get ZANU PF to fail in extending Mnangagwa's term of office, but we need to actually get substantive reforms that reconfigure the state, including electoral reforms.
Yes. No, thank you very much. I think that's this is it's time to call it a night, and to thank you, the both of you, Professor Madhuku and Justice Mavezenke, for taking us through this. Not an easy topic, but it's a topic that a combination of the nature of the topic, but also the people before it, the panelists, has attracted almost 1,000 people, the highest ever. Professor Madhuku, we need to bring you here more often than Justice.
I'm available.
Thank you very much indeed. Until the next time, goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.